A few days ago, we lost David Lynch, and what a huge loss it was. I was actually tearful on off for about an hour after hearing the news, because this guy had had such a strong effect on my attitude to films and my view of humanity and my view of life. I'm going to go into that stuff in this video. All the reasons why Lynch is so culturally important, not just as a filmmaker, but as an explorer of the human condition, because that's what he was. Film just happened to be the main medium that he used, but he was also a painter. He was an artist all round, but also just as much he was a psychologist, but he operated very differently to an academic psychologist. But his work I consider to be just as important. I mean, for me, he has had as much an educational effect on me as the likes of Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud or any of the pioneering psychologists over the past century or so. For me, David Lynch is as important as them. With all of the work that I ever saw of his, I never felt like he was imitating anybody else. And I think that's part of the reason why, as an art house filmmaker, he managed to connect with the masses in a way that most art house filmmakers can't. Because most of them who are considered art house filmmakers, they make cryptic movies and stuff, but most of them, from what I've seen, they are emulating other art house filmmakers, and it kind of shows. But with David Lynch, there was a genuine personal expression. Personal expression came far above any efforts to imitate anybody else. And for me, the three greatest filmmakers across the history of filmmaking who made movies their own way and managed to connect with people, they weren't imitating other people, but they had their own consistent vision that they stuck with, and they made their movies their own and took ownership of the medium. The three greatest were Alfred Hitchcock, Stanley Kubrick, and David Lynch. And I was especially sad for David Lynch going, because all three of them are dead now. And there are some other really good filmmakers around these days, but I haven't come across anybody who has got the originality and caliber of those three in terms of grabbing hold of the entire cinematic medium and saying, right, I'm going to shape this into my own personal vision that nobody's seen before. Unlike most filmmakers, David Lynch took the key inspiration for his work not from other filmmakers, but from his own unconscious. I mean, if you take his very first movie, Eraserheard, which is sort of an allegory in relation to abortion, from what I've read, David Lynch had some guilt problems, some guilt issues to do with maybe having a girlfriend who he got pregnant and she had an abortion. And then he went and made Eraserhead on that very subject. If you watch the movie with that in mind, all of the imagery starts to make sense, and it's like a very intense dreamlike expression. Now, before Eraserhead, I can't remember any other filmmaker making a movie about the issue of abortion. So that's how personal his films were. And he always said that Eraserhead was his most personal film, but I'm not going to talk about it. He refused to explain it. And that was an important thing as well. A lot of filmmakers, to get interviewed about the movies, and they get asked questions, and they say, oh, no, this means this, that means that, and we did this for this reason and that reason. And they explain what the film is supposed to be communicating on its own. But David Lynch wouldn't. A lot of the time in interviews, sometimes it seemed like he was acting stupid, like he would be struggling to find words to explain things, and he would fail to explain it. And other times he'd just tell interviewers, I'm not going to explain that. So I like the fact that he left us with a challenge. It's like, I've made these complex symbolic movies with a lot going on, and you're going to have to figure it out. And I'm not going to explain it for you. I'm not going to make it easier for you. You're going to have to figure it out for yourself. That might seem ironic coming from me, being that I do film analysis stuff. But my point of doing film analysis is not to explain every movie that's ever been made. It's to try and give you the tools where you can interpret movies yourself and make more sense of things and figure things out. And not just movies, but any other media, that you can go and study it and figure it out for yourself and figure out all the psychological depths that you would otherwise miss. So rather than taking inspiration from other filmmakers, he took inspiration from his own unconscious. Like I said at the beginning of this video, he was an explorer of the human condition. And if you're going to explore the human condition, you have to get beyond the verbal and get to the unconscious experience. And David Lynch was absolutely all about doing that in a way that very few people are. And it seems very much to me that David Lynch understood that one of the key doorways we have to the unconscious is our dreams. We have these crazy dreams that almost feel like we've gone into another dimension, and in a way we have, but that dimension is ourselves. We've gone into our own deep unconscious, where we get away from all the verbal descriptions that cloud our judgments in everyday life, and we start getting access to the very core emotions and the symbolic things. And dreams are full of visual symbolism that we don't talk about in daily life very much. And it seems that David Lynch understood this, because he talked about dreams a lot in interviews, and he included a lot of dream-like sequences in his movies. In fact, I believe that in several of his movies, you cannot figure out what the narrative really is unless you figure out which scenes are and aren't dreams. And as far as I know, the only two filmmakers who did that was Stanley Kubrick and David Lynch. They would have what I call hidden dream sequences, where you're watching an event in the story and you think that it's a real event, but actually it's a dream sequence for one of the characters. But you just don't know that. And once you realize it's a dream sequence, all of the symbolism starts to make sense. And Stanley Kubrick, apparently, according to David Lynch, had said that his favorite movie was Eraserhead. And cast and crew from The Shining, which was being made when Eraserhead came out, they have reported that Kubrick got them all together and said, I'm going to screen a movie for you. And he showed them Eraserhead, and he told them, this is the kind of movie that we're making, because The Shining is full of all kinds of symbolism as well. Those of you who watch my videos regularly, you know that from all the videos I've done on that movie. But Eraserhead has got a lot of the same type of dream logic and potent symbolism that The Shining has got, but The Shining has got a surface conscious logical narrative that you can follow that disguises the symbolic aspects of it, whereas Eraserhead doesn't give you a conscious verbal narrative. It just goes full on with the dream sequence stuff and the symbolism. So I think that's why Stanley Kubrick liked him as his favourite filmmakers, because Lynch was delving into the same kind of deeply symbolic areas of the unconscious that Kubrick was trying to explore with his films. And of course, in order to delve into that stuff, you have to be incredibly honest with yourself, and David Lynch was. Lynch knew that all of the darkness that we see in the world also exists within ourselves, and that shows in his movies all the time. You've got these characters who have got these dark sides to them, incredibly dark sides, and his movies explore that. You've got Frank Booth in Blue Velvet, and there's stuff going on with that character in relation to the lead character's father. There's some cross symbolism between those two characters. I haven't produced a video on Blue Velvet yet, but I'm quite convinced that that is there in the film. And Lost Highway as well, that film deals with guilt. The main character is a murderer, and he tries to convince himself that he's somebody else, and he tries to reinvent his own identity, but he can't escape from it because the unconscious guilt resurfaces later in the story in a huge dream sequence, of course. And you get this throughout his movies. With the Elephant Man, you've got the human condition explored in terms of physical ugliness via the Elephant Man himself. And it may be based on a real person, the Elephant Man, but it absolutely explores David Lynchian themes. He would often have Elephant Man type characters who would show up at various points in his movies who would have like physical deformities. Like in Mulholland Drive, there's the very ugly beggar character who shows up a few times in the story and scares the hell out of the characters in the audience. And you've got Blue Velvet, there's some visually distorted images of key characters in the film that make them look physically ugly. And the very ending of Lost Highway has got the same thing, where the lead character is driving away, trying to get away from the police, and then he suddenly dies from. My interpretation of that is that he gets electrocuted in prison for the murder, and that he's actually sort of asleep when he gets electrocuted because he got given pills by a doctor earlier in the story to make him sleepy, and so he gets put in the electric chair while he's asleep, and then it affects his nightmare. But when he gets electrocuted at the end of the film, he starts shaking. You see all the electric lighting and stuff, his face distorts into that of a monster. So yeah, Lynch knew that there was a monster inside of all of us. It'll always be there, and you have to dig deep, acknowledge its existence and deal with it. If you pretend it's not there, it can make you do bad things. And, that's getting into standard psychology stuff, with Carl Jung and the shadow. David Lynch explored the shadow, but in a different way, in his own way, by presenting it as a sort of monster on screen. I think Lynch was also aware as well that life itself, our daily experience of life, is kind of a mixture between, physical reality, unseen energies around us, because he's very into things like transcendental meditation and stuff like that, and our own dream logic. It's like we don't just dream when we're asleep, we dream when we're awake. We have daydreams, and we have dreams of what we want for the future and stuff like that. Dreams are very much tied in with our daily life, but we tend not to acknowledge it, and we often pass off our own dream thoughts as being part of reality when it's just us projecting our ideas onto reality and then thinking it's real. I think David Lynch was very aware of this, and I think that's part of why his movies have a great big confusion over when a character is and isn't dreaming, because life is kind of like that. And I think that Lynch sort of bared his own soul in his movies as well. And I think this is part of why I felt like quite upset when he died, is because I felt like I knew the guy very closely. Obviously I didn't. Never knew him in person, never spoke to him in person, but I felt like I knew the guy through his movies because he was bearing his soul. When he was making movies about the unconscious and dream states and all that, he used himself as the guinea pig to explore all that stuff. So he made movies about things that were going on in his own mind, and mixed it with things that he was observing in other people in the world as well. So yeah, it's like we really got to know a lot about who David Lynch is because he expressed so much of it in his movies, and that's, for me, that's why it felt like such a loss. And I think an absolute key aspect of Lynch that is so important, and I don't think it's widely recognised at the moment, but hopefully one day it will be, is that his willingness to explore the non-verbal is so important because so few people are willing to do this. It's like most of the time we have verbal descriptions of reality and we assume that the way we describe reality is the way that it really is. It's a huge psychological trap. Words are incredibly useful, but they are not reality. And Lynch knew this, and he was trying to get away from verbal descriptions, because if you're going to dig very, very deeply into the unconscious and get towards the soul, if you will, you can't really do that if you're making verbal assessments along that journey. You have to let go of verbal descriptions and start exploring things through your other senses. And that's not airy-fairy garbage. We do have other senses. The verbal is just like a auditory encoding, but we have the visual and we have sensations and we have feelings, and those things are just as important as words. Let me put it this way. If you could live the rest of your life as a blind person or as a deaf person, which would you choose? I would choose to be deaf, not blind. If you're deaf but you can still see, you can take the world of words and just communicate that through writing, because writing is just a visual format of words. So it's easier to live your life if you're a deaf person instead of a blind person. Jesus, if you're blind, you are physically stuck and you're very hard to get along with things. Try describing things to people about the visual world in an accurate way. It's very, very difficult because words are insufficient. And I think this is something that allowed David Lynch to explore aspects of human psychology that academic psychology can't normally get to. Academic psychology, unfortunately, tends to veer towards the idea that things can be coded in words. Academic psychology is always, it seems to be all about mathematical assessments, mathematical representations of reality, and verbal representations. Academia tends to operate exclusively within those two. But when you start stepping outside of that and you get into visual symbolism, with like art and dreams and stuff like that, academic study tends to fall apart and doesn't really know what it's doing in those areas. And but David Lynch, by being willing to do that, to let go of the verbal and explore, he was able to get to certain truths about the human condition that I don't think academic psychology is usually able to get to. In fact, I would say that Hitchcock, Kubrick and Lynch, who I believe are the three filmmakers who most took personal control of the cinematic medium and made it their own, I believe that their ability to get beyond verbal description and communicate their ideas in a fictional narrative way that gets the points across but without describing them in words, to me that makes them like academics. And so for me they are just as important as any academic in terms of exploring the human condition and teaching people about psychology. So I kind of think of Lynch's movies and Kubrick and Hitchcock. I think of Lynch's movies as being like the cinematic narrative equivalent of a very, very well written, well researched academic psychology paper. It's the equivalent of that. In fact, it's better because the academic psychology paper is absolutely limited to communicating its ideas through words, whereas the cinema medium deals with words, obviously, and it deals with non-verbal sound, which is important, music and stuff like that, and it deals with visual symbolism, and it deals with the allegorical narrative element in the same way that a well-written child's bedtime story does. You know, kids learn a lot from bedtime stories about life. They learn important psychological lessons from kids' bedtime stories, and it's like Lynch and Kubrick and Hitchcock. They did the same thing, but for adult audiences, and they took it to a much higher intellectual level. And added to all that, you know, if you read all the various set reports, cast and crew, collaborator reports, people who worked with David Lynch, hardly anybody ever has a bad word to say about him. I can't remember hearing about anybody saying that he was nasty to people on set, or apparently he had a pretty wacky sense of humour and would swear a lot, according to some reports. But he always seemed, it seemed like he was always really nice and caring towards everybody, and he was sensitive towards other people's needs. I mean, it's hard to maintain a persona like that in terms of public relations if it's fake. You know, there's so many movie stars and directors and stuff who set reports come out from over the years that reveal that they could be a real arsehole on set and be nasty to people. I don't think I ever heard that about David Lynch. And that's a pretty cool thing, because directing a movie, it's a very autocratic thing to do. You have to be kind of an authoritarian on set. I mean, I've directed before, and you have to make sure that people do their job and make sure that they don't mess around and ruin things. And you have to stop them from trying to change your creative vision from what you want it to be, because, you know, your collaborators on the film will try to put their creative stamp on it. And sometimes they come up with ideas that are really good, but sometimes they don't, and they try and inject things that you don't want. And you have to be a little bit authoritarian in order to get the job done and make sure that the movie that comes out is your own. And, you know, we've all seen the reports about Kubrick and Hitchcock as well, being quite abrasive with people on set and arguably even manipulative with people or insulting. But we hardly ever heard that about David Lynch. And I find that really surprising, that he managed to make these movies, you know, almost entirely his own in terms of creativity, but he did it with being really, really nice with people. Maybe part of the reason he was able to do that is because the collaborators probably knew that they didn't understand what the real story of the film was, so they would just do what he asked, because they were just like, well, I don't want to mess with this vision because I don't even know what the vision is. I suspect that's part of the reason he was able to get away with being such a nice guy on set. And he looked cool as hell as well. You know, you see the photos of him, and he looks like a real intellectual. You can imagine him at various points in history wearing, like, you know, fancy outfits of people, you know, royalty and academic intellectuals and stuff like that. He just had that look in his face, and that fabulous, bizarre haircut. You know, brilliant. So yeah, love this guy all round, and it's a real loss. And yeah, I was pretty sort of tearful when I found out he died. The last time the death of a celebrity had affected me like that was way back in, I think it was 2003 or 2005, when Charles Bronson died. Yeah, I actually got tearful over that one because there was something about Charles Bronson that I absolutely adored. He's not necessarily my favourite actor ever. There's other actors I like just as much. But I think Charles Bronson had that thing where he didn't communicate so much in words. He communicated with gestures, and he knew how to use his body language and facial expressions and voice and stuff to communicate things. But it was like, it wasn't just his characters in the films that were like that. He himself was like that. And so interviewers had a really hard time trying to interview Charles Bronson because he would just give them these really blunt answers. And if they asked pretentious questions, he'd just give them an answer that was the equivalent of fuck off and, don't insult my intelligence. So I had this absolute love for Charles Bronson's no bullshit attitude. And that was the last time before David Lynch that the death of a celebrity made me tearful. Okay, so Mr. Lynch, I'm going to miss you. And, you're dead now, and Kubrick's dead, and Hitchcock's dead. The three greatest in terms of owning the cinematic medium are dead. It's pretty sad. But anyway, hopefully we will get more people coming to the cinematic scene in the coming decades who have as much creativity and originality. I'm being a bit hopeful here, aren't I? I don't know. Hopefully it will happen. It's not impossible. Okay, this is Rob Ager signing off. Take it easy. Bye-bye.